Steakhouses charge $60 for a piece of meat that costs $8 at the store. The difference is not the meat. My name is Samuel Mast. I farmed 200 acres of Amish land in Millersburg, Ohio, for 30 years. We raised our own cattle. We never bought steak from a butcher shop. Not a single cut in 30 years. I left my community and watched my neighbors pay $50 for a ribeye we cooked for $6. Today, I'm telling you everything. A cheap steak and an expensive steak are not as different as restaurants want you to believe. Most of the price difference comes from the cut. Ribeye and filet mignon are tender by nature. Chuck, flank, and sirloin cost less because they have more muscle fiber, requiring more work to cook right. That work is exactly what Amish farmers understood. Cheap cuts were never a punishment. They were a skill. Let's start with the cheap steak. Buy a chuck steak or a top sirloin under $7 a pound. Look for one at least 1 inch thick. The biggest mistake is cooking it straight from the refrigerator. Cold meat cooks unevenly. Take it out 1 hour before cooking. While it sits, prepare a salt brine. Dissolve 1 tablespoon of coarse salt into 1 cup of warm water. Let it cool completely. Submerge the steak in this brine for 30 minutes. Salt water breaks down tough muscle fiber before heat ever touches it. After 30 minutes, remove the steak and pat it completely dry. Wet meat does not sear. It steams and turns gray, not brown. Once dry, rub the steak with a thin layer of oil or lard. This helps the surface brown evenly in the pan. Season simply with coarse black pepper and a pinch of salt. The point was to taste the meat itself, not cover it up. Heat a heavy cast iron skillet on high for 5 minutes. The pan must be hot enough that a drop of water dances and disappears. Place the steak in the dry, hot pan. Let it sit untouched for 3 full minutes. Moving it early tears the crust. Flip once, cook the other side for 3 minutes. Add a piece of butter and spoon the melted butter over the steak repeatedly. Remove the steak and let it rest for 5 minutes. Cutting too early lets all the juice run out instead of staying inside. While it rests, remember the slicing direction. Cut against the grain. Look for the fibers and slice perpendicular to them. This makes a cheap cut taste noticeably more tender. Brine, dry, sear, rest, and cut against the grain. 5 simple steps. No special equipment, no $60 price tag. Just farmhouse skill for the best steak of your life. Now, let's talk about the expensive steak, because most people overcook it just as badly, just in a different way. Ribeye and filet mignon are expensive because they come from muscles the cow barely uses. Less muscle work means less connective tissue. Less connective tissue means natural tenderness, straight out of the package. This changes everything about how you should cook it. A cheap cut needs help breaking down fiber. An expensive cut already has none to break down. Your only job is to not ruin what's already there. The first rule with expensive steak: never brine it. This surprises people, since brining helped the cheap cut so much. Ribeye and filet already have enough natural fat and tenderness. Soaking them in salt water pulls out flavor you're paying for. Amish farmers who raised cattle understood this difference clearly. You do not treat every cut the same, because every cut is not the same. Instead, take the steak out 45 minutes before cooking, slightly less time than the cheap cut, since thicker premium cuts hold cold longer in the center. Pat the steak dry immediately. Fat marbled steaks release moisture just sitting in plastic. That moisture needs to be gone before any heat touches the meat. Season only with coarse salt. Nothing else yet. Let the salt sit for 45 minutes while the steak comes to room temperature. This is called dry brining, and it is different from wet brining. It draws moisture to the surface, then the salt dissolves back in, seasoning the meat evenly without diluting the natural fat flavor. Right before cooking, add coarse black pepper only. Nothing more. Garlic powder, seasoning blends, and marinades hide the flavor you paid extra for. Amish families never masked it. They let it speak for itself. Heat your cast iron skillet the same way as before. 5 full minutes on high heat. This step does not change between cheap and expensive cuts. Heat control is the one rule that applies to every steak. Here is where the cooking time changes. Ribeye and fillet are thicker and fattier than most sirloin or chuck cuts. A 1.5-inch ribeye needs about 4 minutes per side for medium rare, not 3 like the thinner cheap cut. Do not press down on the steak while it cooks. This is a mistake people make more often with expensive cuts. Pressing pushes out the fat and juice you paid extra money for. Let it sit still and trust the heat. In the final 2 minutes, add butter, fresh garlic cloves crushed with the flat of a knife, and a sprig of fresh rosemary. Tilt the pan and baste continuously. This step matters more here, since the fat rendering off a ribeye mixes with the butter, creating a natural sauce with no extra cost. Use a meat thermometer if you have one. 130 degrees for rare, 135 for medium rare, 145 for medium. Premium cuts lose their advantage fast if overcooked. They cook it too long out of fear, and all that natural tenderness turns to nothing. Rest the steak for 7 minutes. Thicker, fattier cuts need more time for the juice to settle. Cutting early here wastes more flavor than on a thin sirloin. Slicing an expensive steak is simpler than a cheap one. Ribeye and fillet have little to no visible grain. You do not need to hunt for a direction to cut against. Slice it however suits your plate. A cheap steak, prepared correctly, tastes tender for $8. An expensive steak tastes rich and buttery for $20. A steakhouse charges $60 for the same expensive cut, cooked using the same cast iron method I just described. That is the entire difference. Not the meat, not a secret technique, just presentation and a much bigger bill. Amish families separated meat based on method. A tough cut needed patience. A tender cut needed restraint and a hot pan. It is never really about the price tag on the package. It is about whether you understand what that specific piece needs. Let's go deeper into the different cuts, because cheap steak and expensive steak are not single things. Each cut behaves differently, and Amish farmers knew every one by feel, not just by name. Flank steak is one of the cheapest cuts you'll find, often under $6 a pound. It comes from the cow's abdominal muscles, which work constantly. That means heavy grain and almost no fat. Flank steak needs a longer brine than chuck or sirloin. Give it a full 45 minutes in the salt water instead of 30. The extra time matters because flank has tighter fiber than most cheap cuts. After brining, flank also benefits from something called scoring. Take a sharp knife and cut shallow diagonal lines across the surface. This is not decoration. It cuts through tough fiber before it hits the pan, and it helps seasoning reach deeper into the meat. Skirt steak is another cheap cut, thinner than flank, with even more visible grain. Because it's thin, it cooks fast. 2 minutes per side in a hot pan is often enough. Overcooking skirt steak by even 1 extra minute turns it rubbery, since it has almost no fat to protect it. Chuck steak is the most forgiving cheap cut. It has some marbling, so it tolerates a slightly longer cook time. Sirloin tip is often overlooked, but it may be the best value cut. It has moderate marbling and a milder grain. Brine it for only 20 minutes, since it doesn't need as much fiber breakdown as tougher cuts. Now let's go deeper into the expensive side. Because ribeye and fillet are not the only premium cuts either. New York strip sits between ribeye and fillet. It has a firm texture with a strip of fat along one edge. Do not trim this fat. Render it slowly by standing the steak on its side in the hot pan for 1 minute. Porterhouse and T-bone steaks are actually 2 cuts in one, a strip steak and a fillet, joined by a T-shaped bone. Position the thicker strip side closer to the center of the pan, and let the thinner fillet side sit toward the cooler edge. Filet mignon is the most tender cut available, but also the least flavorful on its own, since it has almost no fat. At home, a simple butter and herb paste does the same job as rich restaurant sauces without added cost. Now, a subject Amish cooking handled very differently. Marinades. Amish farmers rarely marinated meat this way. Acidic marinades break down surface texture without improving true tenderness. They mostly just add flavor to the outer layer. Let's talk about the reverse sear method. Place a thick steak in a low oven at 250 degrees first. Amish farmers understood the same principle using a slow wood stove followed by a hot skillet finish. Then transfer it to a screaming hot cast iron pan for just 90 seconds per side for a dark, crisp crust. Ribeye has fat marbled directly through the muscle. As it cooks, this fat melts internally, basting the meat. Save any rendered beef fat left in the pan. Amish kitchens called this tallow, and it was never thrown away. 135 is meat. 5. Pull the steak off the heat 5 degrees before your target number. Price does not guarantee a good result. Method does. Amish farmers proved this every week at their own table. Let's talk about tools now, because Amish kitchens didn't use fancy equipment, but they did rely on specific things that made every steak turn out right. A cast iron skillet is the single most important tool for cooking any steak. Non-stick pans cannot hold the heat needed for a proper sear. Cast iron holds heat steady, even after cold meat hits the pan. Most cast iron skillets cost $15 to $25 and last several lifetimes. A meat thermometer is the second most useful tool, costing under $10. Guessing doneness by cutting into the meat lets precious juice escape. Tongs matter more than people realize. Never use a fork to flip a steak. Piercing the meat lets the juice run out early. A simple splatter screen keeps grease contained without blocking airflow. Amish cooks used a heavy pan lid slightly askew for the same reason. Now let's talk about sides. A steak was never eaten alone on an Amish table. The sides made the meal feel complete without added cost. Potatoes were common because they're cheap and filling. Slice them thin and fry them in the same pan right after the steak comes out. Onions, cooked slowly in that same pan, turned sweet and soft. Deglazing with a splash of water loosens the deep flavors stuck to the bottom. Green beans or cabbage, quickly sautéed with garlic, round out a full plate using nothing beyond what you already have. Nothing new to buy. Now, sauces. This is where a $5 steak can taste like a $30 plate with almost no added cost. Pan sauce is simple. Add water or broth to the hot pan after the steak rests, scraping up every browned bit with a wooden spoon. Garlic butter sauce takes this further. Melt butter into the pan with a crushed garlic clove and a pinch of fresh herbs. Horseradish cream is an Amish favorite for leaner cuts. Mix sour cream with horseradish and salt for a bright, sharp flavor. Let's go over common mistakes. Mistake 1. Not drying the steak. Wet meat steams instead of searing, ruining the crust. Mistake 2. Overcrowding the pan. Space between steaks allows steam to escape, ensuring a proper crust forms on both sides. Mistake 3. Flipping too often. One flip is enough. Constant flipping prevents a proper crust from ever forming. Mistake 4. Cutting into the steak to check doneness. This lets juice escape immediately. Use a thermometer instead. Mistake 5. Skipping the rest period. A steak cut immediately loses nearly a quarter of its juice onto the cutting board. Mistake 6. Seasoning too late. Salt added early, through a brine or dry salt rest, has time to work into the meat itself. Mistake 7. Buying pre-marinated steaks. These are often injected with salt water and preservatives to hide lower quality cuts. Mistake 8. Assuming expensive always means better. A poorly handled ribeye will taste worse than a well-handled, patient chuck steak. Look for steaks with a bright red color, not brown or gray. Fresh meat should feel firm, springing back slightly when pressed. For cheap cuts, look for visible marbling. White fat running through the muscle means more flavor waiting once it's cooked properly. Buying steak in bulk directly from a local farm, as Amish families do, cuts the price dramatically compared to a grocery store. The cooking method matters, but the buying method matters just as much. Buying direct is the biggest gap between retail and value. Here is everything laid out simply, so you know exactly what to do the next time you're standing at the meat counter. For a cheap cut, buy chuck, sirloin, flank, or skirt steak. Brine it in 1 tablespoon of coarse salt dissolved in 1 cup of warm water for 30 to 45 minutes, depending on thickness. Pat it completely dry. Rub with a thin layer of oil. Season with just salt and pepper. Sear in a hot cast iron pan for 3 minutes per side. Baste with butter in the final minute. Rest for 5 minutes. Slice against the grain. Total cost under $8 a serving. For an expensive cut, buy ribeye, fillet, strip, or porterhouse. Skip the brine completely. Dry salt the surface and let it rest at room temperature for 45 minutes. Pat dry again if needed. Season simply with salt and pepper right before cooking. Sear 4 minutes per side in a hot cast iron pan. Baste with butter, garlic, and fresh herbs in the final 2 minutes. Rest for 7 minutes. Slice however suits the plate. Total cost $15 to $20 a serving. Still far below what any steakhouse charges. Notice the pattern running through everything I've taught you. Cheap cuts need help breaking down what's naturally tough. Expensive cuts need restraint, so you don't ruin what's naturally tender. Neither one needs a $60 bill or a chef's jacket. They need attention, patience, and a hot pan. A restaurant is not selling you better meat most of the time. They are selling you a hot pan, a rest period, and slicing done correctly. The exact 3 things I just gave you for free. Start with a cheap cut this week if you're still learning. Chuck steak forgives small mistakes better than a delicate fillet does. Once you're comfortable with brining, drying, searing, and slicing, move up to a New York strip or ribeye and apply the same principles. Adjust it for the fat and tenderness built into that cut. Keep a small notebook near your stove, like I suggested for cheese. Write down the cut, the cook time, and how it turned out. After 4 steaks, you'll know your own stove and pan. Buy direct from a local farm if one exists near you. Amish families never separated eating well from spending wisely. Those 2 things were always the same decision, made at the same time, at the same counter. My grandmother judged a cook not by what cut of meat she was given, but by what she did with it in the pan. A chuck steak, handled with patience, fed a family just as well as any special occasion cut. Nobody at that table ever felt like they were eating less. That is the real difference between cheap and expensive. Not the price, not the name on the package. Just whether the person cooking it understood what that piece of meat needed, and gave it exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. Every dollar spent above that understanding is a dollar spent on convenience. You now know what my family knew standing over a wood stove for 30 years. Salt, heat, patience, and the right cut. That is the entire secret. And it was never expensive to begin with.